Destiny has adepts, Warframe has rivens, and the First Descendant has, attribute roles? Every successful game in the looter shooter MMO genre has a ton of ways to differentiate builds from one another. Last week, I went over the endgame, or lack of it, and compared it to other games in the looter shooter genre. I talked a lot about build crafting and variety, and what actually keeps you and I playing. In the last video, there was a huge amount of discussion, and I've read all the comments that you wrote, and I'm really glad that that hit a pain point for the community. I'm also really glad that we got some differing opinions there. So in this video, I want to cover another massive issue that I've seen talked about online a lot, and that being random roles and the role they play in min-maxing and actually creating a successful build. So let's get right into it. The First Descendant has this very all or nothing mentality when it comes to build crafting. You need this or you need that stat boost for this build to work. And most of the time it's just boosted numbers. There's no way to actually feel those stat boosts outside of like slightly better damage or cooldown. And if you don't have it, everything kind of falls apart and a build doesn't work. The game is sort of stuck in this balancing act where it wants to have tons of variety between each weapon and sort of upgrade paths. But it also wants to stay very grounded and easy to work with, like Warframe. It almost feels like min-maxing is mandatory to feel even the smallest success. And that's not really a fun system because there's no agency or control. Why is build variety and min-maxing overall important? Player retention in this genre is determined by a few things. We already covered aspirational content and build crafting in the last video, but the second largest aspect of player retention is giving players a sense of freedom in creating their own goals. If one player's goal is to clear a piece of content and another's is to clear it as easily as possible using the same base gear, what actually separates the two? This is pretty easy to define in other games. Destiny has the option for better weapon and armor rolls, as well as adept weapons and their mods. Warframe has rivens, progenitor stats on certain weapons, and prime or umbral mods. These are hugely noticeable changes to build crafting and gameplay that make a tangible difference, even when you're looking at them in the menus. Like a riven in Warframe that gives you a massive crit boost, you'll be able to see those stats and you'll know that you're hitting red crits and that you're hitting these big numbers even without going in and testing them out. Where it becomes hard to define is in the First Descendant. There's a lot of times where I've seen people post their builds online, like on Reddit, and they ask why their build isn't working or they're not as successful as others with the exact same build, exact same mods, everything. The issue almost always lies in attribute and weapon stats. Maybe this person's reactor doesn't have a boost to colossi damage, for example. These are sort of arbitrary stat increases for the sake of the grind. There's a stark difference between someone using a prime or a riven mod in Warframe versus someone having a minor gold boost to singular skills on their reactor. There's no real tangible difference outside of damage numbers. Therefore, where in other games you can realize your shortcomings and kind of play or adapt around that, maybe you don't have an adept weapon in Destiny, so that you know that your weapon won't perform as well as maybe what you've seen on YouTube. In TFD, a huge amount of your power comes from these arbitrary stat boosts that are entirely RNG and often overlooked. I want to create a spectrum of min-maxing almost, where a game like Warframe is on one end, where 99% of weapons and frames are the same for each player, and the depth comes from the unique ways you can change and modify everything. Right, like you could have two builds using the exact same weapons, the exact same Warframe, but they play entirely differently based on the mods that you slot in, or maybe the riven that you have, for example. At the other end of the spectrum would be a game like The Division, where there's so many random rolls and minor stat boosts and incentives to farm, and the depth from that comes from the wide range of rolls that you can get and the synergies they create. Destiny is a perfect example of a game in the middle of the spectrum. It has a lot of variable roles and grinding incentives, but everything is grounded in the fact that all of these boosts and rolls are supportive and they add to the base kit, instead of actually making up the entire kit like in The Division. The First Descendant is a really hard to put on this spectrum. It's kind of a weird mess of Warframe and The Division, and that's what we're mainly going to sort of be going over in this video. I'm a huge advocate for random rolls and variable stats. It's personally what keeps me grinding and playing games like Warframe and Destiny. Getting the absolute best version of something feels good and it's rewarding. It's a goal that I like to set for myself. I don't get that from TFD at all. Everything, again, feels very all or nothing. You need all of these minor stat boosts to even begin to feel powerful in the current sandbox. And you can't settle for anything. And that's not what min-maxing and grinding RNG is about. I shouldn't feel like the hours I spent putting catalysts and re-leveling my Descendant, I shouldn't feel like that has all gone to waste because I don't have the perfect stats on my Reactor. And oftentimes that's kind of how it feels. One of the major issues that plagues games in this genre is number crunching and stat grinding. We as players need to feel like we have some sort of control over our success and failure. And I really want to hammer that point in. In Destiny, for example, that may be understanding that you need to get a better perk on your weapon that sort of suits the content better. Maybe in Warframe you need to retool a build to add more prime mods for those extra stat boosts. These games give you options to work around your failures and reconsider your build choices. In the First Descendant, maybe you gotta go farm a new Reactor with an extra 5% skill crit boost. Oh, but that Reactor isn't in the targeted rotation for another 4 weeks. Looks like you gotta settle with what you have. There's no control there. The game has decided that you don't have the minor stat boost to feel powerful, and you either have to grind random untargeted reactors, or settle and come back in 1 to 4 weeks to try again. It feels like I'm playing The Division light, where the game doesn't want to go all in on random rolls and absolutely stacking minor stat boosts, like in The Division, but these boosts are almost ignored by the game itself. They're hidden away and portrayed as these little bonuses on weapons and reactors, when in actual fact they're the main driving force behind power and success. Min-maxing in variable roles creates a tangible pathway to success. It lets us create goals and we can stop and settle at any point. There's always an extra upgrade that you can get, and when you do, you notice the impact of the upgrade. I think a good personal anecdote of this is in Destiny, when it was Igneous Hammer Adept weekend a few months ago. And I sat there and ground for, I think, almost 20 hours that weekend, just farming for the 5 out of 5 perfect Igneous Hammer. I got plenty of rolls that were 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5. It was just missing 1 or 2 things that I really kind of wanted. And I could have settled. I sat there, and I looked and I did the stat comparisons and I pulled up D2 Foundry and I went through the numbers and I just wanted that extra upgrade. I wanted that perfect absolute roll, and that kept me playing. Destiny kept me playing with the concept of min-maxing and variable rolls. And overall, as much as I like to sort of support the notion that fashion is the true end game, if we're actually talking about gameplay, min-maxing is the true end game. It's also not for everyone, but it doesn't need to be. Having the systems in place for min-maxing actually solves a ton of replayability and retention issues. When the game places importance on the random and RNG aspects, it really does let players know what they're getting into. It adjusts the expectations about the gameplay loop and lets us shift and create goals and actually understand where the grind comes in, and it creates a tangible reward at the end of that. Because the real grind in buildcrafting isn't maxing a Descendant with catalysts and an energy activator, and that's sort of how it was portrayed and how a lot of people assumed the grind and the gameplay would actually be. That's seemingly only the start, and more people are realizing that. And I genuinely think that that's why a lot of people are getting burnt out and quitting, because they climb this mountain and then they realize there's an entirely larger mountain of just grinding reactors and grinding weapon rolls. Ultimately, there's a pretty stark gap in what people are expecting to grind for and see success with and what's actually happening. This dissonance is leading a lot of people to not feel rewarded for their effort and therefore lose interest in the game. I said it in the last video, but there's a really strong framework here for a successful game, and the devs seem super committed to actually realizing that potential. But at the moment, the First Descendant doesn't know what it wants to be, and unfortunately, it can't really appeal to everyone. If we keep going down the path that we're on, where it feels like your build needs to be absolutely perfect to take on endgame content and to even see some form of success, it'll isolate a huge part of the community who's sticking around and trying underpowered weapons and Descendants. But on the other hand, if they focus on reducing the impact of stat boosts and min-maxing, they lose a lot of the depth and reward of grinding and sort of endgame progression as a whole. It's a really tough issue, and one that seems very rooted in the systems and progression design. But I think it comes back to the overarching point of this video series, and that's variety. Giving players more ways to stand out and feel unique with their build crafting choices. But anyway, if you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and the First Descendant in its current state. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.